Imagine walking through ancient Rome after a long day of work. The streets are crowded, the air is thick with smoke, and everywhere you look someone is selling food. Fresh bread, hot sausages, fried fish, bowls of stew bubbling over charcoal fires. To a hungry traveler, it would probably look delicious. But if you had actually eaten that food, there is a very good chance you would have spent the night vomiting, feverish, or even dead. Because behind the tempting smells and busy market stalls was a world with no refrigerators, no health inspectors, no expiration dates, and almost no understanding of bacteria. For millions of ordinary Romans, buying dinner from a street vendor was not just convenient. It was a gamble with your life. Most people imagine ancient Romans eating lavish feasts inside marble villas. Roasted peacocks, exotic fruits, and endless wine served by slaves. The truth was very different. Nearly 1 million people lived inside the city of Rome during its peak, and most of them were poor. They lived inside cramped apartment buildings called insulae, tiny rooms with no kitchens and often no fireplaces. Cooking indoors was dangerous because a single spark could burn down an entire neighborhood. So instead of preparing meals at home, countless Romans walked outside every day and bought food from the nearest street stall. Street food was not a luxury. It was survival. As the sun rose over the city, vendors began setting up their shops. Small counters called thermopolia lined the streets. Large clay jars were built directly into stone tables, each one holding a different kind of food. One jar might contain lentil stew. Another held boiled vegetables. A third was packed with wine mixed with spices. The food often stayed inside those containers from sunrise until long after dark. Hours passed. Flies gathered. Dust from the roads settled into the pots. The summer heat baked everything under the Italian sun. And nobody thought much about it. People simply kept eating. The meat was perhaps the greatest danger. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially during the hot months. Without ice or refrigeration, butchers had only one option: sell it immediately or hide the smell. Roman writers complained about merchants rubbing spoiled meat with herbs and heavy spices to disguise the rot. Garlic, coriander, vinegar, and fermented fish sauce could cover many unpleasant odors. A hungry customer walking past the stall might smell only the seasoning. He would never know the animal had been dead for days. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was already inside his stomach. Fish was even worse. The Mediterranean supplied Rome with enormous amounts of seafood. Fish arrived by wagon or ship from distant ports. Sometimes the journey took several days. By the time it reached the city, the flesh had already begun to soften. Vendors packed it with salt or soaked it in sauces to slow the decay. Others simply fried it over open flames and sold it as quickly as possible. The smoke helped hide the odor. The spices fooled the nose. But neither could stop dangerous bacteria from multiplying. For the average Roman customer, there was no way to tell. Then there was the famous Roman sauce called garum. Many historians describe it as the ketchup of the ancient world. Romans poured it over almost everything: meat, bread, vegetables, eggs, even desserts. Garum was made by leaving fish guts, blood, and organs to ferment under the sun for weeks. Workers stirred the mixture as it slowly rotted into a thick liquid. The smell was so powerful that factories producing garum were often built outside cities. Yet once mixed into food, people loved it. It masked bad flavors. It covered spoiled ingredients. And sometimes it helped merchants sell meals that should never have been eaten. The drinks could be just as dangerous. Water inside Rome was not always clean. Although the aqueducts delivered fresh water into the city, many ordinary people collected water from public fountains, storage containers, or shallow wells. These sources could become contaminated by dirt, animal waste, and human sewage. To avoid this, many Romans drank cheap wine instead. But poor quality wine was often watered down and mixed in dirty barrels that had never been cleaned properly. Street vendors reused the same containers again and again. Tiny cracks inside the wood trapped mold and bacteria. Every cup carried risks invisible to the eye. The streets themselves added another layer of filth. Rome had no modern sanitation system. People dumped garbage outside their windows. Animals wandered freely. Dogs searched through piles of waste. Horses and donkeys covered the roads with manure. Open drains carried sewage through crowded neighborhoods. A food seller standing beside the street had little protection from any of it. Dust blew through the air. Flies landed on animal carcasses, then on fresh bread. Rats crawled beneath wooden carts. The customers watched all this happen. Many simply accepted it as part of daily life. Perhaps the strangest thing of all was that Romans knew food could make people sick. They just did not understand why. They blamed bad air, angry gods, curses, unbalanced bodily fluids. A man who became violently ill after eating spoiled sausage might believe he had been bewitched. A family struck by food poisoning could think evil spirits had entered the house. The invisible world of bacteria and germs would remain unknown for almost 2,000 more years. Until then, ordinary people could only hope that today's meal would not become tomorrow's funeral. As darkness covered the city, the busiest food stalls became even more crowded. Workers finished their jobs. Travelers arrived through the gates. Drunk customers stumbled out of taverns looking for one last meal before sleep. The vendors smiled. The fires kept burning. The stew pots were filled again with whatever ingredients remained unsold. Old meat mixed with fresh. Yesterday's broth became today's dinner. Nothing was wasted. In a city where hunger was common, people ate what they could afford. And somewhere in that crowd, another unsuspecting Roman lifted a wooden spoon to his mouth, completely unaware that the most dangerous thing he would face that night was not a thief, not a gladiator, not a wild animal. It was his dinner. By sunrise, the streets of Rome came alive again. The first customers were not wealthy senators or decorated generals. They were laborers. Brick carriers, dock workers, slaves, messengers, and craftsmen hurried toward the nearest food stall before work began. Most had only a few small bronze coins in their pockets. They could not afford fresh cuts of meat or expensive meals, so they bought whatever was cheapest. Unfortunately, the cheapest food was often made from the oldest ingredients, the scraps nobody else wanted. For many Romans, poverty decided what ended up on their plate. Bread was the foundation of almost every meal. Fresh bread was wonderful, warm, soft, and filling. But fresh bread did not stay fresh for long. Vendors hated throwing anything away. Old loaves were soaked in water, wine, or broth until they softened again. Sometimes stale bread was crushed into soups to make them thicker. Other times it was mixed into meatballs to hide how little actual meat was inside. A customer biting into his meal might believe he was eating something hearty. In reality, he was often eating leftovers that had already survived several days. The sausages looked especially tempting. Fat dripped onto the hot coals. Smoke curled into the air. The smell could make anyone hungry. But Roman sausages were often a mystery. The customer rarely knew what animal had been used. Pork was common. Goat was possible. Cheap scraps from several animals could be chopped together. Bones, fat, skin, and organs were all valuable. Nothing was wasted. If a butcher had meat that was beginning to spoil, grinding it into sausage was one of the easiest ways to hide the truth. Once mixed with spices, almost anything could be sold. Many stalls specialized in stews. Large clay pots sat over slow fires for hours. At first glance, they looked rich and comforting. Vegetables floated beside chunks of meat. Steam filled the air. But these pots had a secret. The stew was rarely emptied completely. When business slowed, vendors simply added more water and new ingredients. Yesterday's leftovers blended into today's meal. Sometimes the same pot remained in use for several days. Each reheating killed some dangers, but not all of them. Layer after layer of old food collected inside, creating a meal with a history nobody could see. The vegetables seemed like the safest choice. Beans, onions, cabbage, lentils, olives. Yet even these could become dangerous. Produce was sold in open markets where carts rolled through clouds of dust. Animals wandered between the stalls. Flies landed wherever they pleased. Fresh vegetables were often washed with water from public fountains or storage barrels. If that water was contaminated, the food became contaminated as well. A poor Roman trying to avoid spoiled meat could still end up dangerously sick from what looked like a healthy meal. One ingredient appeared almost everywhere: honey. Romans loved sweetness, and honey was one of the few natural sweeteners available. Street vendors poured it over cakes, nuts, and fried pastries. But not every seller used pure honey. Some mixed it with cheaper syrups. Others diluted it with water. There were even complaints from Roman writers about dishonest merchants adding strange substances to increase weight and profit. Customers had no labels to read. No government standards. Trust was often the only protection they had. And trust could be very expensive. Perhaps the strangest delicacy sold on Roman streets was the dormouse. These tiny animals were considered a luxury snack. Some wealthy households raised them in special clay containers. Others purchased them from vendors. The animals could be stuffed with herbs or dipped in honey before cooking. To modern eyes it seems bizarre. But in ancient Rome, almost every creature was considered potential food. Birds, snails, sea urchins, tiny fish, exotic animals brought from distant provinces. The stranger the meal appeared, the more curious customers became. Curiosity often outweighed caution. Street vendors themselves lived difficult lives. Most were poor. Many had borrowed money to buy their carts or rent their stalls. A bad day could mean hunger for their entire family. Throwing away spoiled food was not simply wasteful. It could ruin them. So they found ways to stretch every ingredient. A little more salt. A stronger sauce. Another trip over the fire. Another customer who might not notice. Most vendors were probably not trying to poison anyone. They were simply trying to survive in a brutal economy where profit and desperation often looked exactly the same. The city authorities occasionally tried to control the chaos. Certain markets had rules. Inspectors existed in some places. Officials could punish merchants who cheated customers. But Rome was enormous. Thousands of stalls operated across crowded neighborhoods. The government could never watch all of them. Corruption made things even worse. A small bribe might convince someone to look the other way. As long as people kept buying food, the business continued. And every evening, new pots of stew and fresh batches of sausage appeared on the streets. Imagine standing in the middle of one of those markets. Smoke rises around you. Someone is shouting prices. A donkey pushes through the crowd. A hungry child pulls at his mother's hand. You see fresh bread. You smell roasted meat. You hear oil crackling over the fire. Everything feels alive. Yet hidden beneath that ordinary scene is a dangerous truth. The food in front of you may have traveled through filthy streets, dirty hands, contaminated water, and several days of summer heat before reaching your bowl. And if you were an ordinary Roman with an empty stomach, you probably would have eaten it anyway. Because hunger has a way of making even the riskiest meal seem worth the chance. Not every street food vendor in ancient Rome was a cheerful old cook serving hot meals to hungry workers. Many were former slaves. Others were immigrants who had traveled from distant corners of the empire. Some had lost everything and saw food stalls as their last chance to survive. A simple wooden counter and a clay stove could become an entire family's livelihood. Every coin mattered. Every customer mattered. And when survival depended on selling food before it spoiled, morality often became a luxury few could afford. The busiest district for cheap food was a neighborhood called Suburra. It was noisy, overcrowded, and notorious throughout the city. Tall apartment buildings leaned over narrow streets. Laundry hung above the alleys. Children ran between carts while thieves searched for easy victims. The smell was impossible to escape. Smoke from kitchens mixed with sweat, sewage, and animal waste. Yet this was exactly where thousands of ordinary Romans came every day to eat. The food was cheap. The portions were large. And for many people, there was nowhere else to go. A typical food stall was surprisingly small. A stone counter faced the street. Several large clay jars were built directly into the surface. Inside them sat soups, beans, wine, vegetables, and whatever meat was available. Behind the counter, a charcoal fire burned from morning until late at night. The vendor worked only a few feet away from the crowd. Dust blew over the food. Flies landed on the bowls. Customers reached across the counter with dirty hands. There were no glass windows. No metal covers. The street itself was part of the kitchen. Keeping food warm was almost as important as cooking it. Romans believed hot food was healthier than cold food, so vendors constantly reheated their meals. A pot of stew might boil 3 or 4 times throughout the day. Pieces of meat were returned to the fire again and again. Sometimes this made the food seem fresh. Sometimes it simply dried it out. But repeated heating created another problem. As liquids evaporated, vendors often added more water. If that water came from an unsafe source, the meal became even more dangerous than before. The customers themselves helped spread disease. People ate with their hands. Coins passed from one person to another. A worker covered in dirt from a construction site could touch the bread before paying. Another customer might cough over the food while waiting in line. Children reached into bowls. Dogs wandered beneath the tables searching for scraps. The vendor rarely had time to clean anything properly. Business moved too quickly. In the crowded markets of Rome, thousands of tiny acts of contamination happened every single day. Nobody noticed. One of the greatest dangers was something the Romans could not even see. Tiny insects. Flies were everywhere. They gathered around animal carcasses hanging from butcher shops. They landed on piles of garbage. They crawled across human waste left in the streets. Then they flew directly onto fresh bread or cooked meat. Modern science tells us exactly what those insects carried. The Romans had no idea. To them, flies were simply an annoying part of life. To us, they reveal just how easily disease could travel from the gutter to the dinner table. Nightfall changed everything. As darkness covered the city, respectable merchants closed their businesses. But the food stalls often stayed open. Taverns emptied into the streets. Drunk customers searched for one final meal. Travelers arriving late looked for cheap food before finding a place to sleep. The vendors knew these customers asked fewer questions. A man who had spent the evening drinking wine was unlikely to complain about old stew or stale bread. The final hours before midnight often became the best opportunity to sell whatever food was left. Nothing went to waste. Some stalls became famous for their recipes. People returned again and again because they trusted the cook. Roman poets even joked about favorite taverns and market foods. But reputation could disappear overnight. One bad batch of meat. One contaminated barrel of wine. One customer dying after dinner. Rumors spread quickly through crowded neighborhoods. A vendor might wake up the next morning to find nobody willing to buy his food. In ancient Rome, trust was almost as valuable as the food itself, and far easier to lose. Archaeologists have uncovered remarkable evidence of these ancient food stalls. Buried beneath volcanic ash and collapsed buildings, many thermopolia survived for nearly 2,000 years. Painted walls still show ducks, chickens, and drinking cups. Large clay containers remain fixed inside stone counters. Animal bones discovered nearby reveal what people actually ate. Goat, pig, fish, snails, even traces of ducks and small birds. These discoveries paint a vivid picture. Street food was not a small part of Roman life. It was one of the foundations of the entire city. If you could step into Subura on a busy evening, you might think it looked strangely familiar. People rushing home from work. Friends laughing over drinks. A vendor calling out today's special meal. The smell of roasting meat drifting through the air. At first glance, it would feel like any modern street market. But then you would notice the flies. The overflowing drains. The carts carrying dead animals. The dirty water splashing through the streets. And suddenly you would realize that behind every delicious smell lurked a simple and terrifying possibility. The next bite you take could be the one that makes you violently ill. And in a world without antibiotics or modern medicine, that ordinary dinner might become the last meal you ever eat. For an ordinary Roman, getting sick after eating was simply part of life. A man might finish a bowl of stew at sunset and wake in the middle of the night with terrible stomach pains. His body would burn with fever. Sweat soaked his bed. Violent vomiting and endless cramps left him too weak to stand. His family could do little except offer water and prayers. Nobody knew that invisible organisms inside spoiled food were attacking his body. To the Romans, it was bad luck. Or perhaps the anger of the gods. Without modern medicine, even a simple case of food poisoning could become deadly. Dehydration was a silent killer. A person who lost too much water through vomiting and diarrhea could collapse within days. Children and the elderly suffered the most. Poor families living in crowded apartments had almost no access to proper care. Doctors existed, but many charged more money than ordinary workers could afford. For countless Romans, surviving illness depended entirely on chance. A cheap meal bought from a street stall could cost far more than a day's wages. It could cost a life. Roman medicine offered many strange treatments. Some doctors believed sickness came from an imbalance of the body's natural fluids. Others blamed cold air or evil influences. Patients were told to drink herbal mixtures. Some swallowed vinegar mixed with spices. Others were given honey, wine, or crushed plants. A few remedies may have provided comfort. Many did absolutely nothing. And some probably made the illness even worse. While the patient suffered, the real cause remained untouched, hidden inside the contaminated food that had started it all. Parents worried constantly about feeding their children. A growing child needed food every day, but poor families had few choices. Street vendors were often the only affordable option. A mother might hand over a few small coins for bread and sausage, hoping it would be enough to fill an empty stomach. She had no way to inspect the meat. No way to know how long it had been sitting in the heat. No way to see the bacteria multiplying inside it. She simply trusted the seller. In ancient Rome, trust was often the only ingredient that could not be measured. Travelers faced even greater risks. Merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims passing through the city had no familiar vendors to rely on. They stopped wherever the food looked hot and the prices seemed fair. Many arrived exhausted after days on dusty roads. Hunger overpowered caution. A stranger could easily become the perfect customer for dishonest merchants trying to sell yesterday's leftovers. If the traveler became sick and died days later in another town, nobody would ever connect his death to the meal he had eaten in Rome. The vendor simply continued serving the next customer. Ironically, some wealthy Romans looked down on street food completely. They considered it food for slaves and laborers. Rich families preferred private cooks and household kitchens. But even wealth could not eliminate danger. Servants bought ingredients from the same markets. Fish came from the same docks. Meat came from the same butchers. Spoiled food did not care whether a person wore rags or expensive silk. Disease crossed every social boundary. The emperor himself ate food produced by the same imperfect world as everyone else. Today, archaeologists continue uncovering traces of these forgotten meals. Burned pieces of bread. Animal bones. Cooking pots blackened by ancient fires. The remains tell a fascinating story. Romans loved convenience. They loved fast meals that could be eaten while walking through the city. In many ways, their food culture was surprisingly modern. A worker grabbing a quick lunch from a Roman thermopolium was not very different from someone buying food from a busy street cart today. The biggest difference was something we rarely think about. Modern food safety did not exist. The dark truth is that most Romans probably accepted these dangers. Life itself was dangerous. Buildings collapsed. Fires spread through neighborhoods. Bandits attacked travelers. Disease haunted every family. Street food was simply another risk among many. People could not stop eating because they were afraid. They had to work. They had to survive. A laborer earning just enough money for one hot meal was unlikely to ask difficult questions about where the meat came from. An empty stomach was often more frightening than spoiled food. So what would happen if a modern person suddenly found themselves in ancient Rome? The markets would seem exciting. Fresh bread baking over open fires. Fish sizzling on iron grills. Sweet cakes covered with honey. Crowds laughing and bargaining beneath stone buildings. You might even think the food looked better than expected. Then you would remember there were no refrigerators. No health inspections. No understanding of germs. No antibiotics waiting if something went wrong. One meal. One unlucky choice. That would be all it took to turn an unforgettable adventure into a nightmare. When people imagine ancient Rome, they often picture mighty legions, grand temples, and victorious emperors. They rarely think about dinner. Yet for millions of ordinary citizens, finding something to eat was one of the greatest challenges of daily life. The street food stalls that filled the city offered warmth, comfort, and a brief escape from hunger. But they also hid spoiled meat, dirty water, dangerous bacteria, and invisible threats that nobody understood. The next time you walk past a modern food truck or a crowded street market, remember the people of ancient Rome. 2,000 years ago, they stood in lines much like ours, holding a few coins and hopping for a good meal. Some went home satisfied. Some went home sick. And some never realized that the darkest danger in the greatest city on earth had not been war, crime, or wild beasts. It had been the food waiting quietly inside a simple clay bowl.